In this video, we're going to talk about borrowing chords from a parallel key or a parallel mode. Doing something like this can create unexpected leaps in harmony, and it can also make your chord progressions more intriguing. Before we get into it, let's first talk about what a parallel key or a mode exactly is. So, when two keys are parallel, that means that they share the same root notes, but they have a different sequence of notes otherwise. An example of this would be C major and C minor. They have different sets of notes, but they both start on C, so therefore they're parallel to another. And the same principle goes to the modes too. C Ionian, which is the modal name for C major, is parallel to C Dorian, C Phrygian, C Lydian, C Mixolydian, C Aeolian, and C Locrian. So that's the concept of a parallel key or mode. So when we borrow a chord from such a place, it's exactly how it sounds. Basically, if you have a song that's in some kind of key, you would be stepping outside of that key, borrowing a chord or maybe a couple of chords from a parallel sound, and then inserting it in there to give the chord progression maybe a more unpredictable energy. And doing something like this is not a full-blown key change. We are just temporarily suspending the original tonality with our borrowed chords. Because usually when we borrow chords, we're usually only taking a singular chord, or perhaps maybe a couple. The more and more chords that you take from outside your original key, the more fuzzy the original sound starts to get. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyways, let's get right into it. C major has the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B. It has the chords C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and also B diminished. So, in any major key, there are lots of types of chord progressions. One of the most common is the 1-4-5, and in the key of C, that would be the chords C, F, and G. That would sound something like this. So the 1-4-5 is a pretty great type of chord progression, and there's a lot you can do with it. Very easy to harmonize with, but maybe it's a little bit too predictable. Maybe it's too derivative. Maybe we want to change it up a bit. So what we could do is we can take from the parallel minor, which is C minor. C minor has the chords C minor, D diminished, E flat major, F minor, G minor, A flat major, and B flat major. So we could take one of those and insert it into the progression, and it will change up the sound quite a bit. I decided to choose the A flat major, and I put it in right before the G chord in the progression. Here's what it sounds like. So that was the borrowed chord A flat. It definitely changed the aesthetic a little. I put it right before the G for a specific reason. It's a half step above a G, so the transition from A flat to G was pretty seamless. On top of that, the G chord has a lot of tension around it because it's the dominant. It wants to resolve to the 1. So by incorporating that borrowed chord right before the dominant, we essentially extended the tension so that the resolution at the 1 was arguably even more satisfying. So yeah, that's a A flat borrowed chord. And by the way, it's not only from the parallel minor, but it is also found in the parallel Phrygian scale too. So if you were to harmonize over that chord in this context, you could tentatively use that scale as well as the parallel minor. So that's something to keep in mind. You do have some options. Just for fun, let's put a B flat in there too. Here's what I came up with. B flat also sounds quite nice. and that also is found not only in the parallel minor, but the parallel mixolydian scale as well. Notice that when we add a second borrowed chord, it does start to muddy up the original tonality a little bit. It starts to get a little bit more distant from that classic C major sound. And honestly, that's fine. It sounds pretty good at the end of the day, and that's what matters most. Okay, so I think you understand the concept of borrowing chords. Well, for the remainder of this video, what I'd like to do is present to you the most convincing and most common types of borrowed chords that are used in popular music. The first type is basically when you're in a major key, but you borrow the 4 chord from the parallel minor. So if we're in C major, that means we would be borrowing an F minor from the C minor sound. So here is the specific way that it can be very effective. Basically, you have a chord progression that starts on a C, and then it goes to maybe A minor, the 6th chord. Then we go into F, but the regular F. Then F minor, and then back to C. So this type of cadence is pretty common, and it has this melting aesthetic to it, the way that it just dissolves back to the C chord. And there is a reason why it does that. Inside those 3 chords, there is a chromatic note that's descending. Basically, if you look into the F chord, its 3rd is this A. The 3rd of the F minor is the A flat. And then the 5th of the C is this G. So there is this happening in the context of... So that's how that cadence works. And there are other variations on this type of borrowed chord progression. Oftentimes, they'll use some kind of secondary dominant, and I talked about this in my secondary dominant video, linked below if you're interested. But oftentimes, songwriters might use like an E7 in there. Maybe they'll do something like this. Or maybe they'll do a C7 instead. The next type of commonly used borrowed chord I want to talk about is actually very similar to this F minor, and that is borrowing the 2 from the parallel minor, which would be D diminished. So we would actually use this in the same way that we use the F minor. Specifically, if we take the D diminished and we add a diatonic 7 into it, making it D half diminished. Here's a voicing that I'll use. So here's how it sounds in the fuller context that I'm talking about. Yeah, so you can tell it has the same kind of sound, and that's largely due to the fact that the notes in D half diminished are pretty much identical to F minor, except for the fact that there is a D in D diminished as well. Also, too, there's that same voice leading that's going on, this thing. A variation on this type of chord progression is to, instead of an F major, actually do a D minor right before the D half diminished chord. The next type of borrowed chord I want to talk about is when we borrow the 5 chord from the parallel LOCRIAN scale, which would be G flat major. So sticking a G flat major in a progression with a C major is pretty jarring, especially because both of these chords are a full tritone apart from each other, so there's a really grand cosmic quality to playing them one after another. You actually hear this in the Radiohead song Just, off of the album The Bends. It's in the chorus of the song. So yeah, if you want to have a potentially captivating or really unexpected chord change in your progression, try that tritone separated major chord. It has a cool effect, in my opinion. Another really common type of borrowed chord is when we're in a minor key, but we borrow the 5 from the major key. So let's say we're in C minor. Instead of using G minor, we would be using G major. The G major chord can be used as a dominant chord to resolve to the 1, the C minor, something that is otherwise absent in the minor key. So it's pretty common for songwriters to borrow the parallel major's 5 chord to get that tension and resolution effect. Here is a way that you could use it. Another borrowed chord example is if you're in a minor key, but you borrow the 2 from the parallel Phrygian scale, which would be D flat major. A common usage of this is to actually stick it right before the borrowed 5. That extended tension is quite nice. It's actually a little darker than an earlier example that we talked about. And in European classical music, composers would often take such a chord, but they would invert it so that the F was in the bass. And they would refer to it as the Neapolitan 6 chord. So if you ever see Neapolitan 6 or N6, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to that type of cadence. But this is what the D flat with an F in the bass would sound like, at least in one voicing. One more type of borrowed chord I'd like to talk about is when you're in a minor key, but you borrow the 4 chord from the parallel major. So if you're in C minor, it's like playing an F instead of an F minor. Oftentimes, they will use this chord as a secondary dominant to get us to a 7 chord in the minor key, which in this case would be B flat. So you'd have something like this. And then you go wherever from there. I have an example where it uses that kind of move, but in a full chord progression. Here's what that sounds like. I believe that chord progression is actually pretty similar to Take On Me's, if I'm not mistaken. Another way you could use this 4 major in a minor key is you can use it to lead you into the 5 major. So you would have 2 borrowed chords in a row, the 4 and 5. Overall, there's lots of different types of borrowed chords. The ones that I provide to you, in my opinion, were some of the more useful ones. But feel free to go crazy and to try out all different kinds of chords, even if they don't make sense harmonically. At the end of the day, writing songs is about having fun, seeing what works, what sounds good to your ears. So try some things out. See what sounds good. Let me know how it goes in the comments. But anyways, thanks for watching this video. I hope you feel inspired to write some cool and interesting chord progressions. Happy songwriting.